On a cold, overcast afternoon in New York City, the wind whistled through the narrow streets, sending shivers down the spines of those who dared brave the late autumn chill. Riverbend General Hospital stood tall and imposing against the dull gray sky, its glass and steel exterior gleaming with a sterile, almost indifferent sheen. Inside, the hospital hummed with the sounds of beeping machines, rushing footsteps, and murmured conversations. Nurses and doctors moved about swiftly, their white coats flapping behind them as they attended to patients, some with urgent care needs, others waiting anxiously for their turn. Amidst this chaos, the sliding glass doors at the hospital's main entrance whooshed open, allowing a sharp gust of wind to follow Chloe Davis into the lobby. Chloe, a striking young black woman in her early 30s, clutched her swollen belly with one hand, her breath quickening with each contraction. She was 9 months pregnant, and the pains had been coming fast and hard for the last few hours. Her labor had started suddenly with no time to prepare or even make a proper plan. All she knew was that she had to get to the hospital, and quickly. Her husband, David Davis, had been unreachable when she first called him, and there was no time to wait for him now. Her friend had rushed her to the hospital as quickly as possible, and Chloe prayed with every step that she could hold on just a little longer until someone could help her. The hospital lobby was busy but not overcrowded. Patients sat in chairs lining the walls, some clutching injuries, others coughing weakly, and a few flipping through magazines with detached expressions. At the front desk sat Nurse Karen, a middle-aged woman with an air of authority that radiated from her even as she sat, slightly hunched over the desk, typing furiously into the hospital's computer system. Her blonde hair was pulled back tightly into a bun, her lips pressed into a thin line, as if she could hardly be bothered to deal with the people sitting before her. Chloe approached the desk, her face pale with pain, her hand still protectively cradling her belly. Her other hand reached out to steady herself against the counter as another contraction tore through her, causing her to gasp for breath. She looked at Karen, hoping to see some flicker of concern or empathy in the nurse's face, but Karen didn't even glance up from her screen. "Excuse me," Chloe began, her voice shaky but polite. "I'm in labor. I need help. Please." Karen sighed, barely lifting her eyes from the computer monitor. "Fill out these forms," she said in a bored tone, gesturing toward a clipboard that sat on the counter. Without so much as a second glance, she continued typing, her attention fixed on whatever administrative task was more important than the pregnant woman standing before her. Chloe's heart sank. She knew she didn't have much time, and the pain was becoming unbearable. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. "I don't think I can fill out forms right now," she said, her voice faltering slightly as another wave of pain gripped her. "I really need to be seen by a doctor. My contractions are coming too fast." Karen glanced up briefly, her cold blue eyes sweeping over Chloe with a look of mild irritation. "Everyone has to fill out the form," she said flatly. "You're not the only one in labor today. Just sit down and wait your turn like everyone else." Chloe blinked, trying to process what was happening. How could this nurse be so dismissive? She wasn't asking for special treatment. She was just asking for the basic care any woman in her situation would need. She bit her lip, feeling tears of frustration and pain well up in her eyes. "My husband, David Davis, is an investor in this hospital," Chloe said, hoping the mention of his name would prompt the nurse to take her seriously. "I don't want to cause a scene, but I really need help right now." At the mention of David's name, Karen's expression changed, but not in the way Chloe had hoped. Instead of softening with concern or recognition, Karen's lips curled into a slight smirk. "Oh, so you think just because your husband's important, you should get special treatment?" she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "That's not how it works here. Everyone's equal when they walk through those doors. You'll wait like everyone else." Chloe's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. It wasn't just the dismissive tone. It was the clear implication that Chloe was somehow trying to use her husband's status to get ahead, when all she was asking for was the medical attention she urgently needed. The pain in her abdomen intensified, and she had to grip the edge of the counter to keep herself upright. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible now. "I don't have much time." Karen rolled her eyes. "Just sit down and wait," she said again, her voice growing impatient. She looked past Chloe, scanning the room as if she were searching for someone more deserving of her attention. And then, as if on cue, the doors to the hospital lobby opened once again, and a white woman, looking far less distressed than Chloe, walked in, holding her lower back with one hand and her purse with the other. She had the slightly irritated look of someone dealing with minor discomfort, but nothing in her demeanor suggested she was in immediate danger. Without hesitation, Karen stood up and moved around the desk, grabbing the wheelchair that had been left near the entrance. She wheeled it over to the new arrival, offering her a warm, sympathetic smile. "Here, honey," she said sweetly. "You look like you could use a chair. Why don't you sit down?" Chloe watched in disbelief as Karen helped the woman into the wheelchair. "Excuse me," she called out, trying to keep her voice steady despite the anger and hurt bubbling inside her. "I was here first. I'm in labor." Karen shot her a withering look. "I can see that, but you need to learn some patience. Besides, this lady doesn't look so good. She probably needs the chair more than you do." Chloe's legs trembled beneath her, the pain radiating through her body with every contraction. She felt lightheaded, as though the world around her was spinning out of control. How could this be happening? How could she be standing in a hospital, a place that was supposed to offer care and compassion, being treated like she was invisible, like her pain didn't matter? The white woman, now comfortably seated in the wheelchair, gave Chloe a brief glance before turning her attention back to Karen, who continued to fuss over her, asking if she needed anything else. Chloe felt utterly abandoned, standing alone, clutching her belly, while the pain grew worse by the second. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. Desperate, Chloe pulled out her phone with shaking hands and dialed David's number again. This time he picked up on the first ring. "David!" Chloe gasped, her voice cracking with emotion. "I'm at the hospital. They won't help me. They're treating me like I don't matter." David's voice, usually calm and composed, was filled with urgency and concern. "What do you mean they won't help you? Where are you? I'm coming right now." "They made me stand," Chloe whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm in so much pain, and they gave the wheelchair to someone else." David was silent for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Chloe could hear the sharp intake of his breath on the other end of the line. "I'm on my way," David said, his voice firm. But Chloe could hear the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Stay right there. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Chloe hung up the phone and leaned against the counter, trying to brace herself against the next contraction. She had no choice but to wait for her husband to come and fight for her, because clearly no one else was going to. The minutes felt like hours as Chloe stood there, her legs trembling with the strain, her body barely able to hold on. Every breath she took felt like a battle, and with each passing moment, she felt her hope slipping away. She could hear Karen still talking cheerfully to the other woman in the wheelchair, oblivious to the anguish unfolding just a few feet away. Chloe's hands clenched into fists, her fingernails digging into her palms as she fought back the tears of frustration and humiliation. But Chloe knew one thing for sure. David would be here soon, and when he arrived, things were going to change. Chloe stood there, her entire body tense with pain and disbelief. Each contraction felt like a wave crashing over her, growing more intense and more frequent. But despite everything, she tried to maintain her composure. Her heart raced, her breath came in short gasps, and her hands clutched the edge of the counter as though it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. How had things escalated to this point? A hospital, a place that was supposed to offer safety, care, and compassion, had become a place where she felt utterly powerless. She glanced around the room, hoping to catch someone's eye, anyone's, who might notice her condition and come to her aid. But the waiting room was filled with people absorbed in their own struggles, patients clutching at their own injuries or ailments, nurses rushing past without so much as a glance in her direction. Everyone was too busy, too preoccupied, or simply too indifferent to notice the woman in visible distress just a few feet away from them. The weight of the situation was beginning to crush her. Chloe had always prided herself on being strong, on handling adversity with grace and dignity, but right now in this moment, she felt small, weak, and vulnerable. She was moments away from bringing her child into the world, yet here she was, standing in the middle of a hospital, feeling as though she didn't matter at all. The humiliation was almost as painful as the contractions that racked her body. The minutes stretched on, and Chloe's hope that someone would step in and help her began to fade. Her eyes darted toward the clock on the wall, the second hand ticking away slowly, each tick like a cruel reminder of how much time was slipping through her fingers. Her breathing was becoming more labored, each contraction hitting her like a freight train, yet there was no sign of relief in sight. Another contraction hit, harder than the last, and Chloe let out a soft, involuntary moan. She could feel the muscles in her abdomen tightening, squeezing with relentless force, and she doubled over slightly, unable to stand upright under the pressure. Her vision blurred for a moment as she tried to focus, tried to keep her mind from spiraling into panic. She heard a voice, a sharp, impatient voice, that cut through the fog of her pain. It was Nurse Karen, still behind the desk, speaking with someone else, someone who wasn't Chloe. "Mrs. Harlow, I'll be with you in just a moment," Karen said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescending sweetness that Chloe had never received. "Let's get you comfortable, okay?" Chloe's eyes flickered toward the interaction. The woman Karen was addressing, Mrs. Harlow, sat comfortably in the wheelchair that had been offered to her just moments after Chloe had arrived. Mrs. Harlow didn't seem to be in any significant discomfort. In fact, she appeared almost bored, casually flipping through a magazine while Karen fussed over her. The sight of it stung, more than stung, it enraged Chloe. This woman, who appeared to be in far less need of immediate care, was being catered to as though she were royalty, while Chloe, who could barely stand, was being left to suffer. It wasn't just the physical pain that hurt, it was the blatant disregard for her, the sense that she was invisible, or worse, that she didn't deserve the same care and attention as others. She wasn't stupid. She knew exactly what was happening here, and it made her blood boil. The way Karen had dismissed her, the way she had prioritized someone else, and the way she had made that smirking comment about special treatment, it all added up to one thing. Chloe's heart pounded in her chest, not just from the exertion of labor, but from the deep, simmering anger that was building inside her. She was being judged by the color of her skin, by the assumptions Nurse Karen had made the moment she laid eyes on her. Chloe had experienced racism before, of course, subtle, insidious, or sometimes blatant. But never had she imagined that she would face it here, at such a vulnerable time when she needed help the most. Another contraction hit, this one even more intense, and Chloe gasped, her legs nearly buckling beneath her. She could feel herself weakening, her strength draining with each passing second. Her vision swam, and for a brief, terrifying moment, she thought she might pass out. I can't do this anymore," she whispered to herself, the tears welling up in her eyes. She needed help. She needed David. With trembling hands, Chloe pulled out her phone and dialed David's number again. Her fingers shook so badly that she almost dropped the phone, but she managed to press the call button. This time, the phone barely rang once before David picked up. "Chloe! Chloe, what's happening?" David's voice came through the line, filled with worry. Chloe could hear the tension in his voice, the urgency. It gave her a small sense of comfort, knowing that he was on his way, but the reality of the situation still weighed heavily on her. "They're not helping me," Chloe said, her voice breaking as the tears finally spilled over. She didn't want to cry, didn't want to sound weak, but the pain and frustration were overwhelming her. "I told them I'm in labor, but they're ignoring me. The nurse, she's treating me like I'm nothing." David's tone shifted instantly, his worry turning into sharp anger. "What? What do you mean they're ignoring you? You're in labor." "She made me stand. She gave my wheelchair to someone else. She doesn't believe me," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm in so much pain, David. I don't know how much longer I can take this." "Stay calm, Chloe. I'm coming right now. I'll be there in 5 minutes." "Just hold on," David said, his voice growing more urgent. "I'll handle this." Chloe nodded, even though he couldn't see her. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, trying to find some measure of calm amidst the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She had to hold on. David was coming. Everything would be okay once he got there. But the minutes that followed were some of the longest and most painful of Chloe's life. Each contraction felt like a mountain she had to climb, and her body was reaching its limit. She was drenched in sweat, her clothes clinging to her as she struggled to stay upright, her hands still gripping the counter for support. The hospital's bustling atmosphere felt like a world away from her personal hell. People walked past her, nurses continued their rounds, and the receptionist remained oblivious to the silent suffering of the woman just a few feet away. And then, as if to add insult to injury, Chloe overheard Nurse Karen laughing softly with Mrs. Harlow. "Some people really think they can just snap their fingers and get whatever they want," Karen said, her voice low but dripping with disdain, "like they're the only ones who matter." Chloe didn't need to hear the rest to know exactly who Karen was talking about. The casual cruelty of it stung more than any of the physical pain she was enduring. It was dehumanizing. It was as though she wasn't even a person in Karen's eyes. Just an inconvenience, a nuisance to be brushed aside. The anger that had been simmering beneath Chloe's surface finally boiled over. She couldn't take it anymore. The pain, the dismissal, the feeling of being invisible. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, Chloe turned toward the nurse's desk and tried one last time to make her voice heard. "Please," she shouted, her voice hoarse with desperation. "I need help. I'm in labor, and I need someone to help me now." Her voice echoed through the lobby, turning a few heads but not the ones that mattered. Karen barely glanced in her direction before rolling her eyes and muttering something under her breath. Chloe could feel her strength slipping away, her body betraying her as the contractions came faster and harder. Her vision blurred with tears, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, she felt truly hopeless. Was this how it was going to end? Was she going to give birth right here, in the middle of the hospital lobby, with no one to help her? She leaned heavily against the counter, her body trembling with the effort of holding herself upright. Each second felt like an eternity, and Chloe was beginning to think that maybe David wouldn't make it in time. Maybe she would be left here, alone, ignored, while her baby's arrival drew closer with every agonizing moment. But then, just as she thought she couldn't hold on any longer, she heard the sound of the hospital doors sliding open once again. This time, it wasn't just another patient or nurse entering the lobby. It was David, her husband, her lifeline. And from the look on his face, Chloe knew immediately that things were about to change. David entered the hospital lobby like a storm, his tall frame cutting an imposing figure against the sterile, whitewashed backdrop. His usually calm, composed demeanor was nowhere to be seen. The second he walked through the sliding doors, his eyes immediately searched the room, scanning past nurses, patients, and staff, until they locked onto Chloe. She was hunched over, leaning against the counter with her face contorted in pain, and the sight hit him like a punch to the gut. In an instant, David's heart rate spiked, adrenaline coursing through his veins as he crossed the room in long, urgent strides. His mind raced, each step bringing with it a surge of anger, fear, and protective instinct. He had always been the kind of man who could handle pressure, who kept his cool in the most trying situations. As a successful businessman, an investor, and a father-to-be, he was used to having control. But seeing Chloe like this, his wife, the love of his life, struggling in obvious distress, broke through all of that calm exterior. This was different. This wasn't a boardroom negotiation or a business deal. This was his wife in pain, neglected in the one place where she should have been receiving care. When he finally reached her, Chloe's legs buckled slightly, and he was there just in time to catch her, his strong arms wrapping around her trembling body. "Chloe," he breathed, his voice tight with worry. "I'm here. I'm here now." Chloe lifted her tear-streaked face to meet his gaze, her eyes glassy from the pain and exhaustion. There was relief in her expression, but also something else, something darker. The anger she had tried to suppress, the helplessness, all of it was now reflected back at him. David could feel it, and it only fueled his own growing fury. How could they have let this happen to her? David glanced around, his eyes finally landing on the nurse behind the desk. It was obvious that Karen had been the one responsible for Chloe's condition, the one who had failed to help her. As Chloe leaned against him, struggling to catch her breath, David's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he looked at the woman who had so callously ignored his wife. Nurse Karen stood behind the desk, still typing away on her computer, her face completely void of any concern. She barely even registered David's presence until he cleared his throat, the sound like a thunderclap in the quiet tension of the room. When she finally glanced up, her expression shifted from mild indifference to something more guarded, but still she didn't seem to grasp the gravity of the situation. David, trying to control the sharp edge in his voice, spoke through clenched teeth. "What the hell is going on here? Why is my wife standing here in labor, begging for help, while you're sitting there doing nothing?" Karen blinked, clearly taken aback by his directness, but she quickly composed herself, her lips pressing into a tight, thin line. "Sir," she began in that same condescending tone Chloe had been forced to endure, "I understand you're upset, but we're very busy today. There are procedures we have to follow. Your wife needs to wait her turn like everyone else." David's eyes flashed with anger, his fists clenching at his sides. "Wait her turn?" he repeated incredulously. "She's in labor. She's been in pain for who knows how long, and you're telling me she needs to wait? Is that the kind of care you give here? Is this what Riverbend General Hospital is known for?" Karen's eyes flickered with a brief moment of hesitation, but she quickly masked it with a dismissive shrug. "Sir, as I said, we're following standard protocol. Everyone has to go through the same process." David's temper flared, and he stepped closer to the desk, his voice lowering into a dangerous calm. "You don't know who I am, do you?" Karen frowned, glancing between him and Chloe, still clearly not understanding the full situation. "I know who you are," she said with a tone of irritation. "Your wife already mentioned that you're some kind of investor. But that doesn't change anything. We don't play favorites here." David's face hardened. "Play favorites?" His voice dripped with disbelief. "Is that what you think this is about? You've been ignoring a woman in labor. You made her stand while you gave a wheelchair to someone else who wasn't even in as much pain. This isn't about playing favorites. This is about doing your damn job." Karen's face flushed, a flicker of defensiveness crossing her features. "Sir, I don't make decisions based on what people say. We assess patients based on their needs. Your wife wasn't in an emergency situation." David's eyes darkened, and he shook his head slowly, his voice lowering to a cold, measured tone. "You didn't even look at her. You made a decision the second you saw her, didn't you?" For the first time, Karen's composure faltered. There was a slight shift in her posture, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with a forced air of authority. "I'm following protocol," she repeated, her voice a little less confident now. "There are rules." "Rules?" David's voice rose slightly, cutting her off. "Is that what you're hiding behind? Rules? My wife is in labor, and instead of treating her with care, you left her standing here in agony. And for what? Because you decided, without even checking her, that she didn't deserve help?" Karen opened her mouth to respond, but at that moment, another figure appeared at the far end of the lobby, the hospital's administrator, Dr. Sarah Blake. She had been alerted by a nearby nurse about the commotion in the waiting room, and as soon as she spotted David, a man she recognized immediately due to his significant financial contributions to the hospital, her heart sank. Dr. Blake hurried toward them, her face a mixture of concern and professionalism, and it was clear she understood the gravity of the situation without needing to ask any questions. "Mr. Davis," Dr. Blake said, arriving at the scene with an air of authority but also clear anxiety. "What's going on here?" David, still holding Chloe as she leaned heavily against him, turned to face Dr. Blake. His expression was taut with frustration, but he kept his voice steady. "My wife has been standing here for almost an hour, in labor, with no help. This nurse," he gestured toward Karen, his voice thick with accusation, "has been ignoring her, dismissing her pain, and treating her like she doesn't matter. I had to leave work and rush here to find her like this, sitting on the floor because she couldn't stand any longer." Dr. Blake's eyes widened as she took in the scene. The pain on Chloe's face, the way David's arms were wrapped protectively around her, and the tension radiating off him in waves. She turned to look at Nurse Karen, whose face had grown noticeably paler as she realized the full scope of the situation. "Is this true?" Dr. Blake demanded, her voice sharp as she addressed Karen. Karen stammered, clearly caught off guard by the intensity of the moment. I didn't realize she was in active labor," she muttered. She wasn't showing the signs I would normally expect. I assumed she was exaggerating. Exaggerating? David repeated, his voice rising with disbelief and anger. You assumed my wife was exaggerating her pain? You didn't bother to check her. You didn't even look at her properly. You just made a judgment call based on your own assumptions. Dr. Blake's face flushed with anger as well, though it was directed at Karen. We do not assume anything in this hospital, she said sternly. We assess patients based on their symptoms and immediate needs. And from what I'm seeing, you failed to do that, Karen. Karen looked down, her face a mix of shame and defensiveness. I just didn't think. That's the problem, David interjected, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. You didn't think. You saw a black woman in labor and you dismissed her. You didn't think she was important enough to prioritize. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Karen, visibly shaken, opened her mouth as if to protest, but no words came out. She knew deep down that there was no defending her actions. Dr. Blake, sensing the mounting tension, took a deep breath and turned back to David and Chloe. Mr. Davis, Mrs. Davis, I am deeply sorry for what has happened here today. This is not how we treat our patients, and I will personally see to it that this situation is addressed immediately. Karen, you are suspended from your duties, effective immediately, pending an investigation. David didn't respond right away. His jaw was still clenched, his eyes burning with anger. But Chloe, leaning into him, placed a hand on his arm. She was exhausted, her body drained from the stress and pain, but she was relieved to finally be acknowledged. Please, Chloe whispered, her voice hoarse. I just want to be seen. I need help. Dr. Blake nodded quickly, motioning to the nurses nearby. Of course. Let's get Mrs. Davis to a room immediately. As the nurses rushed to wheel Chloe toward the delivery ward, David stayed by her side, his hand never leaving hers. His heart was still pounding, the adrenaline still surging through his veins. But as he looked down at Chloe, he knew one thing for certain. He would make sure that this never happened again. Not to his wife, not to anyone. This hospital, this system, had failed them, but he wouldn't let that stand. As they wheeled Chloe away, he turned back briefly to look at Karen, whose face was now ashen, her posture slumped in defeat. For a moment, David considered saying something more. But then he realized that words wouldn't be enough. What needed to change was much bigger than this single moment. With Chloe's hand still in his, David walked beside her, knowing that the battle for justice had only just begun. David followed closely behind as the nurses wheeled Chloe toward the delivery ward. His heart was pounding, each beat heavy with the weight of what had just happened and what was still to come. Chloe's grip on his hand tightened occasionally, a silent message that she was still fighting through the pain, but also that she needed him right there, by her side, for whatever lay ahead. The corridors of the hospital seemed to stretch endlessly in front of them, the fluorescent lights overhead casting a cold, clinical glow that only heightened David's simmering anger. His mind raced, replaying the scene with Nurse Karen over and over again. He could still feel the tight knot of fury in his chest as he thought about how she had treated Chloe. Like she wasn't important, like she wasn't deserving of basic care. David had spent his entire life building a reputation, amassing wealth, becoming an investor in this very hospital to make a difference. Yet here they were, his wife treated with the kind of casual disregard that he had fought so hard to shield her from. Chloe, who was about to bring their child into the world, had been forced to endure not just physical pain, but emotional humiliation as well. The hospital buzzed around them, nurses and doctors going about their duties, but none of them seemed to realize the weight of what had just transpired. David felt like he was moving through a parallel universe, one where his world was falling apart, while everything around him continued as if nothing had happened. He could feel Chloe's exhaustion through her fingers, the tension in her body from hours of being ignored, from the stress of fighting to be seen, heard, and cared for. He wanted to do something, anything to make it right. But for now, the only thing that mattered was getting Chloe through this safely. Finally, the nurses reached the delivery room, a private space that felt slightly more welcoming than the sterile halls they'd come from. The bed was ready, and they helped Chloe onto it as carefully as they could. though David could see the pain flash across her face as she settled in. He stayed beside her, never letting go of her hand, even as the medical staff began prepping her for what would come next. Dr. Sarah Blake entered the room, her expression one of contrite professionalism. David felt a surge of bitterness rise in his throat at the sight of her. Though she hadn't been the one to ignore Chloe, she was still part of the system that had failed them. Dr. Blake stood near the bed, her eyes flickering between Chloe's pained face and David's tight expression, clearly aware that her role in this situation had shifted dramatically. "Mr. Davis, Mrs. Davis," Dr. Blake said, her tone soft but firm, "I want to personally apologize again for what you've experienced today. It was unacceptable, and I assure you, we are addressing the situation with Nurse Karen immediately. But right now, our focus is on making sure Chloe is safe and that your baby arrives without any further complications." David didn't say anything, his jaw still clenched as he glanced down at Chloe, who nodded weakly. Chloe's face was pale, her body still tense with the strain of her contractions, but she seemed grateful that things were finally moving in the right direction. She had fought so hard to get to this point, and now at last she was being treated with the care she had deserved from the start. As the nurses and doctors began working efficiently around Chloe, checking monitors, adjusting IVs, and preparing for the delivery, David felt an odd sense of disconnect. Here was his wife, about to give birth to their child, a moment that should have been filled with joy and anticipation, yet all he could think about was the injustice of it all. How close had they come to something far worse? What if he hadn't arrived when he did? What if Chloe had been left alone, her condition worsening because of one person's negligence and prejudice? He couldn't shake the image of Chloe, hunched over in pain, being ignored by the very people meant to help her. It was more than just a personal affront. It was a symptom of something much larger, something that had always lurked beneath the surface, but now felt painfully real. How many other women, how many other Black women, had experienced the same kind of dismissal, the same neglect, because someone had made assumptions about their pain, their worth, their right to care? As Dr. Blake continued to issue orders and the team moved into action, David stood at Chloe's side, his mind half in the present moment and half already planning for what came next. He wasn't just David Davis, the husband and soon-to-be father. He was also David Davis, a man with influence, a man with the power to change things. He had invested in this hospital not just because it was good business, but because he believed in its mission, in the idea that healthcare was a right, not a privilege. And yet, here they were, proof that even in the best institutions, inequality and prejudice could still rear their ugly heads. Chloe squeezed his hand again, drawing his attention back to her. Her eyes fluttered open, meeting his, and in that brief moment, the world around them seemed to shrink down to just the two of them. He could see the exhaustion etched in her face, the pain, but also the determination. Chloe had always been strong, stronger than anyone gave her credit for, and even now, in the midst of this ordeal, she was holding on. "I'm so sorry," David whispered, leaning down closer to her, his voice thick with emotion. "You should never have had to go through that." Chloe smiled weakly, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "We're here now," she murmured. "That's what matters. Our baby's almost here." David swallowed hard, blinking back the surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. Chloe was right. Despite everything, they were moments away from meeting their child. But even as he tried to focus on that, on the happiness that should have filled this moment, the anger still gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The minutes that followed felt like hours. The medical team was in full swing now, talking in hushed tones as they worked around Chloe, monitoring her progress, preparing for the baby's arrival. David never left her side, holding her hand, whispering words of encouragement, even though he could feel the tension in his own body, the weight of the injustice they had faced still pressing down on him. At one point, Chloe's eyes fluttered shut, her breath coming in shallow gasps as another wave of contractions hit. David's heart clenched in his chest as he watched her fight through the pain, her body shaking with the effort. He wanted to take it away, to shoulder some of that burden for her, but all he could do was stay beside her, offering his silent strength. The sounds of the hospital, beeping machines, the soft murmur of voices faded into the background as David focused entirely on Chloe. He could feel his anger slowly morphing into a kind of cold determination. He knew that after this, after their baby was born, he wouldn't just walk away and forget what had happened. He couldn't. The image of Chloe, ignored and in pain, was seared into his memory, and he knew that as long as he had a voice, as long as he had power, he would make sure no one else had to endure what they had. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the moment they had been waiting for arrived. Chloe's face contorted with effort, her body trembling as she pushed through the final stages of labor. David was right there, holding her hand, whispering words of love and encouragement, his heart pounding in his chest as the reality of the moment hit him all at once. And then a sound. A small, fragile cry pierced the air, filling the room with the unmistakable sound of new life. Chloe let out a soft sob of relief, her eyes filling with tears, as the nurse placed their newborn daughter in her arms. David looked down at the tiny, wriggling bundle, his breath catching in his throat as he saw their daughter for the first time. She was perfect, small, pink, and full of life, her tiny fist clenched as she cried out her first introduction to the world. Chloe cradled their daughter against her chest, her face soft with exhaustion, but glowing with the kind of joy that only a new mother can feel. David reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and gently touched the baby's soft cheek, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions coursing through him. For a moment, just a brief, fleeting moment, all the anger, the frustration, the sense of injustice faded into the background. All that mattered was this: his wife, his daughter, and the love that filled the room. This was the moment they had fought for, the moment that should have come without the struggle, but it had come nonetheless. Tears filled David's eyes as he leaned down to kiss Chloe's forehead. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Chloe smiled up at him, her eyes shining with tears. "She's everything," she whispered back. But even as David looked down at their daughter, even as the joy of the moment filled him, he knew that this was just the beginning. Their family had been made whole, but the fight wasn't over. There were too many others out there, too many women like Chloe, who faced the same struggles, the same neglect. And now, more than ever, David knew that he had a responsibility to do something about it. As the nurses quietly worked around them, as Chloe rested with their newborn daughter in her arms, David made a silent promise to himself and to his family. He would not let this moment be forgotten. He would not let Chloe's suffering go unanswered. The hospital might have failed them today, but he would ensure that it didn't happen again. Not to them, not to anyone. David sat down beside Chloe, wrapping an arm around her as they both gazed down at their daughter, their hearts full of love. But in the back of his mind, the wheels were already turning. Change was coming, and he would make sure of it. The delivery room had quieted down after the whirlwind of activity that had ushered their daughter into the world. The medical staff had stepped back to allow Chloe and David a few moments of peace, leaving them alone with the newborn miracle in Chloe's arms. The bright overhead lights had been dimmed, casting a softer glow over the room, and the sterile hum of machines had faded into the background. For the first time in hours, Chloe allowed herself to exhale, to relax into the bed. Her body was exhausted, every muscle aching from the hours of labor and the emotional toll of the day. But in this moment, none of that mattered. Her gaze was fixed on their daughter, tiny and perfect, resting peacefully against her chest. The little girl's eyes were closed, her delicate hands curled into fists, her breath coming in soft, rhythmic puffs. Chloe could feel the rise and fall of her baby's chest. Each tiny exhalation, a reminder of the life they had just brought into the world. It was surreal, beautiful, and overwhelming all at once. David sat beside the bed, his eyes never leaving his wife and their newborn daughter. The storm of emotions that had raged inside him for hours had finally begun to settle, replaced by a deep, profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude that Chloe was safe, that their daughter was healthy, and that they had made it through one of the most difficult days of their lives. But beneath that gratitude still simmered the unresolved anger at what they had endured, what Chloe had endured. David had never felt so powerless as he had watching his wife, the strongest person he knew, be reduced to begging for basic care. And that was something he couldn't let go of. Chloe, sensing his thoughts even without looking at him, gently touched his hand. "David," she said softly, her voice still weak but filled with the warmth that always seemed to calm him. "She's here. We're okay. You don't have to keep holding on to that." David blinked, looking down at Chloe's hand on his. He knew what she meant, knew that she was trying to soothe him, to help him let go of the anger that had been brewing since they'd first stepped foot in the hospital. But it wasn't that simple. How could he let go when the memory of Chloe standing there, in agony, being ignored and belittled by the very people who were supposed to help her, was still fresh in his mind? "I know," David said, his voice low, trying to keep it even. I can't stop thinking about it. What if I hadn't come when I did? What if something had happened to you or the baby because they refused to help?" Chloe sighed, her gaze falling to their daughter. "But you did come, and we're both okay. That's what matters now. Don't let what happened steal this moment from us. She's healthy, David. She's perfect." David's heart swelled with love for Chloe, for her ability to see the light even in the darkest of situations. She had always been the one to remind him of what was important, to pull him back when he became too consumed by his need for justice, for control. But this time, it felt different. This wasn't just about them. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger issue, one that David couldn't ignore. He had to do something. He owed it to Chloe, to their daughter, and to every other woman who had been treated the way Chloe had. "You're right," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "This moment is ours. But I can't just let this go, Chloe. What happened to you today? It can't keep happening. Not here, not in this hospital, not to anyone. I'm going to make sure of that." Chloe looked up at him, her tired eyes soft with understanding. She knew David well enough to know that once he set his mind on something, there was no stopping him. And she also knew that he was right. What had happened today wasn't just a personal affront. It was a systemic failure, one that needed to be addressed. But at that moment, all Chloe wanted was to hold her daughter, to focus on the joy of their new family. There would be time to fight for change later. "I know you will," Chloe said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But right now, just be here with us." David nodded, feeling the weight of her words sink in. He leaned over, pressing a soft kiss to Chloe's forehead, then another to the top of their daughter's tiny head. He inhaled the sweet, new baby scent, a mixture of innocence and warmth, and for a moment, the world felt right again. In that small space surrounded by the quiet hum of the hospital, it was just the three of them. A nurse entered the room quietly, careful not to disturb the peaceful scene. She smiled gently at Chloe and David, then checked on the baby, her movements efficient but respectful of the family's need for privacy. David watched her, feeling the contrast between this nurse's kindness and the cold, dismissive attitude of Nurse Karen. It was another reminder of the disparities in care that Chloe had faced earlier, and the frustration bubbled up again. But this nurse, her calm, professional demeanor, helped ease some of that tension. She was doing what should have been done from the moment Chloe walked into the hospital, treating her with dignity and respect. "Everything looks good," the nurse said quietly, adjusting a blanket over the baby. "She's doing beautifully. And you're recovering well, Mrs. Davis." Chloe nodded, offering a tired but grateful smile. "Thank you." The nurse glanced at David, her expression soft. "If you need anything at all, just press the call button. We'll be right outside." As the nurse left the room, David's mind wandered back to the conversation he'd had with Dr. Blake earlier, just before they brought Chloe to the delivery room. She had promised to suspend Nurse Karen and launch an investigation, but that wasn't enough. David wanted more than temporary solutions. He wanted real, lasting change. And with his influence as an investor, he knew he had the leverage to make that happen. He stood up slowly, stretching his legs after hours of sitting by Chloe's side. He needed to clear his head, to think about the next steps. But as he turned to leave the room, Chloe's voice stopped him. "David," she called softly, her eyes half closed, clearly on the edge of sleep. Where are you going? I'll be right back, he said, leaning down to kiss her again. Just going to talk to Dr. Blake. I need to make sure they take this seriously. Chloe frowned slightly, her exhaustion weighing heavily on her. But she didn't argue. She knew David was right. She just hoped that whatever happened next wouldn't overshadow the happiness of their daughter's birth. David slipped out of the room, his mind already racing with plans and strategies. He needed to find Dr. Blake and make it clear that this wasn't just about Karen's behavior. It was about the culture of the hospital, the policies that allowed this kind of neglect to happen in the first place. As he walked down the hall, his steps purposeful, he thought about all the women who had likely been in Chloe's position before, treated as though their pain didn't matter. He thought about the stories he had heard, the statistics about maternal mortality rates for Black women in America, and the countless families who had suffered because of it. It didn't take long to find Dr. Blake. She was standing near the nurse's station, talking quietly with another doctor, her brow furrowed in what appeared to be a serious conversation. When she saw David approaching, she excused herself and walked toward him, her expression still carrying the weight of what had happened earlier. "Mr. Davis," she greeted him, her voice measured but cautious. "How is Chloe doing?" "She's recovering," David said, his voice tight with restraint. "The baby is healthy, but that doesn't change what happened today." Dr. Blake nodded slowly, her eyes meeting his with the understanding that this conversation wasn't over. "I understand. I want to assure you that we're taking this very seriously. Nurse Karen has been suspended pending a full investigation." "That's not enough," David said, his voice firm but controlled. "This isn't just about Karen. It's about the entire system here. What happened to Chloe today isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a much bigger problem. And if we don't address it now, it will keep happening. To other women, other families. I won't let that happen." Dr. Blake's face tightened, a look of concern flickering across her features. She nodded, understanding the gravity of what he was saying. "You're right. This is a much larger issue, and it's something we've been trying to address, but clearly, more needs to be done. I'm willing to work with you to make sure we implement real change, not just for Chloe, but for all of our patients." David's eyes narrowed slightly, gauging her sincerity. "I want to be part of that process. I want to make sure this hospital becomes a place where no one, no matter who they are, has to beg for basic care. We need to overhaul the training, the policies, the entire culture. I've invested in this hospital because I believed in its mission, but today I saw how far we still have to go." Dr. Blake nodded again, more resolute this time. "I agree, and with your help, we can push for those changes. I'll arrange a meeting with the board, and we'll start outlining a plan. You have my word." David studied her for a moment longer, then finally nodded. "Good. I'll hold you to that." As Dr. Blake turned to walk away, David felt a sense of satisfaction, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was just the beginning. He had made sure Chloe was heard, but there were still countless others who needed a voice. And he wasn't going to stop until every patient who walked through the doors of Riverbend General Hospital received the care and respect they deserved. He made his way back to Chloe's room, where she was resting quietly, their daughter cradled in her arms. David stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them, his heart swelling with love and determination. He had fought for his family today, and now he would fight for something even bigger, for justice, for equality, for change. Because no one, especially not the woman he loved more than anything in this world, should ever have to endure what Chloe had gone through. With a deep breath, David walked back into the room, sitting down beside Chloe, who stirred slightly as he took her hand in his once more. He leaned over, kissing her gently on the cheek, his voice soft but filled with resolve. "It's going to be different," he whispered. "I promise you that." A few days had passed since the whirlwind of events at Riverbend General Hospital, and Chloe was finally home, resting in the comfort of their cozy living room. The scent of lavender and fresh linen filled the air, and the soft hum of life outside the window provided a calming background noise. Chloe sat cradling their newborn daughter, who was peacefully sleeping in her arms, her tiny chest rising and falling with each soft breath. The ordeal they had gone through still weighed heavily on her, but now in the quiet of their home, there was a sense of peace. David sat beside her, his gaze alternating between his wife and their baby. He hadn't stopped thinking about what had happened at the hospital, how Chloe had been mistreated, how easily things could have gone wrong if he hadn't arrived in time. Every time he replayed that day in his mind, the anger resurfaced, but it was tempered now by a sense of purpose. He wasn't going to let it end with just an apology from the hospital or a temporary suspension for Nurse Karen. That wasn't enough. He had already spoken to Dr. Blake again since they had left the hospital. They had a follow-up conversation where she informed him that the internal investigation was underway. Nurse Karen had been dismissed from her position after multiple witnesses corroborated Chloe's account of the incident, and Riverbend General had issued a public statement acknowledging the incident. But for David, the statement was just the beginning. He wanted more. He wanted lasting change. Chloe shifted slightly in her seat, adjusting the blanket around the baby. She looked at David, her eyes reflecting the exhaustion of a new mother, but also something deeper, an understanding of what he was feeling. She knew David wasn't the kind of man who could walk away from a situation like this without trying to fix it. It was one of the reasons she loved him so much. His need to protect, to ensure justice, was part of who he was. "David," she said softly, breaking the silence, "what are you thinking about?" David glanced at her, his expression thoughtful but determined. "I've been thinking about the hospital, about everything that happened, and how it can't just be swept under the rug." Chloe nodded, her gaze dropping to their daughter. "I know. I keep thinking about it too. How close we came to... I don't even want to think about it." David's jaw tightened. He didn't like to think about it either, but it was impossible to ignore. The statistics had always been there. Stories of Black women suffering in silence in hospitals, their pain dismissed, their concerns overlooked. But now it wasn't just a statistic. It had happened to Chloe, to the woman he loved, and that made it personal. "I'm going to do something about it," David said, his voice low but filled with resolve. "I've already spoken to Dr. Blake, but this is bigger than just one incident. We need real systemic change. This hospital and hospitals like it need to be held accountable for how they treat patients, especially Black women." Chloe listened, her eyes soft with understanding. She knew that David wouldn't rest until something was done, and honestly, she agreed with him. She didn't want what had happened to her to happen to anyone else. She thought about the other women, the ones who didn't have someone like David to fight for them, and it broke her heart. Chloe had experienced firsthand how easily the system could fail, and it terrified her to think about how many others were suffering in silence. "What do you have in mind?" she asked, curious about what David was planning. David took a deep breath, leaning forward slightly. "Dr. Blake asked me to lead a committee focused on patient care, specifically addressing the disparities in how patients are treated based on race, socioeconomic status, and other factors. It's a start, but I want to do more than just talk. I want to make sure policies are changed, mandatory training, stricter oversight, real consequences for anyone who ignores or mistreats patients. It's going to take time, but I'm not going to stop until we make this hospital a model of how things should be done." Chloe smiled, her heart swelling with pride at David's determination. She had always known he was a fighter, and now seeing him take on this cause with such passion, she knew that change was possible. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing worth fighting for ever was. But with David leading the charge, she believed they could make a real difference. "I'm proud of you," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth. "You're doing the right thing, not just for us, but for everyone." David reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm doing it for you," he said, his voice full of emotion. "I can't let what happened to you happen to anyone else." Chloe leaned into his touch, grateful for his love and support. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, the weight of their shared experience hanging between them, but no longer feeling as heavy. Together they were stronger, and together they would make sure this moment led to real change. A week later, Riverbend General Hospital issued a formal statement to the public. It was carefully worded, acknowledging the incident that had occurred with Chloe and outlining the steps they were taking to address the systemic issues within their organization. They confirmed Nurse Karen's dismissal and announced the launch of an internal investigation aimed at retraining their staff on ethical patient care, with a particular focus on eliminating racial bias in treatment. But more significantly, The hospital had committed to a complete overhaul of its patient care policies. A new task force, led by David Davis, had been created to examine and address disparities in healthcare treatment at the hospital. The task force would work closely with medical professionals, patient advocates, and community leaders to ensure that every patient, regardless of race or background, received the care and respect they deserved. The hospital's public statement was accompanied by a press release, which was picked up by several media outlets. The story of Chloe's experience, combined with the hospital's response, sparked a wider conversation about the racial disparities in healthcare across the country. News outlets covered the story, and it wasn't long before David and Chloe found themselves at the center of a larger movement. They began receiving messages from people all over, some sharing their own experiences of neglect in healthcare, others offering support and solidarity in the fight for change. David had expected some attention, but the response was overwhelming. He was contacted by other hospitals, healthcare organizations, and even politicians who wanted to discuss how they could implement similar changes in their own institutions. The fight for better healthcare had grown beyond Riverbend General Hospital, and now it was becoming a national issue. For Chloe, the experience was both empowering and emotional. She had gone from feeling invisible in a hospital lobby to becoming a symbol of resilience and hope. But it wasn't about the attention for her. It was about the countless women who had suffered in silence, whose voices had gone unheard. She felt a responsibility to them, to use her story as a catalyst for change. David, too, felt the weight of that responsibility. Leading the committee was just the beginning. He was determined to see it through, to push for real reforms that would make a difference in the lives of patients. He met with healthcare professionals, participated in panel discussions, and worked with policy experts to develop new guidelines for patient care that would be implemented at Riverbend and hopefully beyond. The hospital also began rolling out mandatory cultural competency and anti-bias training for all staff, ensuring that every nurse, doctor, and administrator understood the importance of treating every patient with dignity and respect, regardless of race or background. David worked closely with Dr. Blake and other leaders at the hospital to oversee these changes, making sure that they were more than just lip service. He wanted real, tangible results, improved outcomes for patients, a reduction in complaints, and a shift in the hospital's culture toward one of empathy and accountability. As the weeks turned into months, the changes began to take root. The hospital's atmosphere shifted, becoming more inclusive and welcoming. Staff were held to higher standards, and the stories of neglect and mistreatment that had once plagued the hospital began to fade. David made sure that every step of the process was transparent, involving patients and community leaders in the decision-making process. He wanted Riverbend General to become a beacon of hope, a model for other hospitals across the country. And through it all, Chloe stood by his side. She attended meetings, shared her story at public forums, and used her voice to amplify the voices of others. Their daughter, now growing and thriving, was a constant reminder of why they were fighting so hard, for a better, more just future. In the end, the changes they fought for didn't just benefit Chloe or David. They benefited every patient who walked through the doors of Riverbend General Hospital and every patient who would one day walk through the doors of hospitals across the nation. David had kept his promise. Things were different, not just for them, but for everyone. And as they sat together in their living room, watching their daughter sleep peacefully in her crib, Chloe and David felt a deep sense of peace. They had turned a moment of pain and injustice into a movement for change. They had made sure that their story would not be forgotten, that it would inspire others to stand up, to fight back, and to demand the care and respect that every human being deserved. Chloe leaned against David, their hands intertwined, and whispered, "We did it." David smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "We did, and we're not done yet." They had started a revolution in healthcare, one that would continue long after the headlines faded. It was a fight they would carry forward, for their daughter, for their community, and for everyone who had ever been made to feel invisible. The world was changing, and they were part of that change. Together, they had made a difference,